So after the disgruntled drop in the bucket that was GoldenEye Rogue Agent, which managed to piss off a good chunk of the fan base, EA had to really step it up for the next title or else risk killing off any good faith they had left with the 007 IP. Despite defending it to some extent, Rogue Agent definitely wasn't what people seemed to have wanted at the time, and in the end it definitely felt like a filler title as EA was pretty much doing a Bond game every year. So the question was, what were they gonna do next? Everything or Nothing did so many things right that it'd be incredibly difficult to top. Well, I seriously doubt anyone would have expected a game series to go in this direction. So during EA's era with the series, outside of the first two games, they were all about making original stories instead of just basing it off specific movies. But for the first time since The World Is Not Enough, this trend would be broken. The next 007 video game outing would be based on From Russia with Love, the second movie ever made. This was mind-blowing for me as a kid. At the time, I was really getting into the movies, especially the Sean Connery era. So to see this time frame be the next game in development, oh, I was on hype overload. Then to see that it's gonna play similar to Everything or Nothing's gameplay style, oh yeah, fucking bring it. Then on top of all of that, to find out that Sean Connery would be reprising his role as 007 one more time, I was sold and I knew I'd be buying this game as soon as I possibly could. In fact, let's discuss just how big of a deal getting the original Bond back truly was at the time. Sean Connery hadn't played this role since that unofficial sequel called Never Say Never Again, so at the time it'd been like 20 years since he was ever involved in this franchise in any form. So to see him here one more time was quite the treat, and that's something I really want to praise the old EA for. Sure, nowadays the name is usually identified with hate and disgust due to their shitty and shady practices, but back during the 6th generation, they were doing this franchise justice for the most part, and really went out of their way for their last couple Bond games. Alongside Everything or Nothing, they wanted to make this game feel as close as possible to mimicking a movie. So to get these big time actors to do the voice work on these games added so much to it, especially when EA went out of their way to get the right actor for that version of Bond. I mean, don't get me wrong, I do enjoy Daniel Craig's version of Bond, but it always irked me when they remade GoldenEye and Activision couldn't be bothered to get any of the original actors back for that title. By all means, if it's an original story, then just use whoever the current Bond is. It only makes sense. And while nothing against Daniel Craig, but after seeing what EA did with From Russia with Love, it definitely makes things feel a little bit lesser. Hell, they even got the original likeness for these actors. Sure, it's not the original actors doing the voice work, I mean, it's kinda hard to when most of them are dead at this point. I mean, this is based on an early 60s movie after all. And while I will admit it is a little jarring hearing old man Connery's voice come out of what looks like a younger version of him, it's still just the point. This team went as far as they possibly could in this department, and to me makes this title stand out that much more because of it. Now, I know in the grand scheme of things this is an aspect that's not a major deal when it comes to the game's total quality, but still, I just really appreciate this kind of stuff. But let's get into the actual gameplay. So, From Russia with Love is a retelling of the movie it's based off of, and essentially acts as a spiritual sequel to Everything or Nothing offered. It's once again a third-person perspective, and once again a lot of those main gameplay elements make a return here, such as lock-on aiming, grappling hook, etc. Just the mechanics were either refined, adjusted, or dropped completely in favor of some new ideas. In terms of aiming, it's similar to what came before. You can still lock on to enemies, but unlike last time, if you actually want to move the aiming reticle, now you have to focus in on one of them, which can lead to some weak spots, or items that you can shoot such as an enemy's grenade to blow them up, or take out these big guys' armor, or their walkie-talkies to name a few. In a lot of ways, I would have considered this a major improvement. Sure, you still can't free aim with most weapons, but this was a lot more refined. It's just a shame damage is static outside of those weak spots. It just doesn't make sense when you can pop these fuckers in the head and they'll still get up. It's actually pretty disappointing, honestly, especially after how much of the headshots I loved in Everything or Nothing. And unfortunately, that goes for the melee as well. Before, you could hit enemies whenever you wanted, but now you'll only physically hit an enemy if you're right beside them, leading to a button prompt to take them out quickly. Sure, it's more flashy, but it's just not the same. Just a little quick time button prompt, and sadly that makes the combat feel a little lesser in my opinion. But other than that, all the stuff you could do in Everything or Nothing is fairly retained here. The only major omission here was the Bond sense where you could slow down time to a crawl to pick your weapons and gadgets, or survey your surroundings. Now the game just pauses when you're selecting your gun or gadget. A bummer that it doesn't make a return, but what we got instead is much more impressive. This time around, Bond actually has a character progression. As you play, you'll find and unlock guns to add to your growing inventory, as well as finding other little goodies like different outfits, special ammo for most guns, but most importantly, you can find these schematics throughout many of the levels that you can use to upgrade your guns, body armor, and gadgets. This edition has huge effects on the gameplay when it comes to exploration. Unlike Everything or Nothing, levels aren't nearly as spread out, as there's only 14 main missions this time around, but they're pretty similar to Nightfire as they're a lot beefier in length, so it equals out. But in doing so, EA had to make these levels bigger, which means that more than ever, the game promotes and wants you to explore these locations a lot more, and there are plenty of stuff and hidden goodies to find and interact with. This bumps up the replay value tenfold, since now you're going to want to try and see if you can find any points you missed, cause there's a lot of stuff to upgrade here. Incorporating a semi-RPG or Metroid-like item mechanic is easily the best new feature this game adds to its gameplay. It's just a damn shame the driving segments took so much of a hit here. Before, you'd drive in a few different vehicles, and usually had different levels to drive on. There might have been a little bit of a reuse in the last game, but there was still enough to make them stand out. This time though, there's about 4 driving missions, with 3 of them taking place on the same map. Sure, it's different objectives, but it definitely gets boring after a little bit. But the other major problem is, well, it's just not as fun to control anymore. On a technical side, driving does feel a lot harder to control in my opinion. I'm constantly crashing into stuff this time around. Also, the combat in these segments just don't feel as exhilarating this time. I get it, this is supposed to feel like a 1960s Bond film, but 007's car just feels so basic compared to what we've seen before. All he has is his bullet shots, missiles that aren't nearly as cool, and his rim shot from his wheels that can flip out their cars over. Admittedly pretty cool and satisfying when you can pull it off, but you can only do this so many times before the novelty wears off. I don't know, it's passable, but not nearly as exciting as it used to be previously. There are also a couple on-rail sections too, but they're pretty par for the course. Though they do transition between on-rails and normal gameplay pretty seamlessly, which is actually a bit of a first for this series, so I can give it that at least. But I guess the last thing to really talk about for single player is actually progressing through the story. Doesn't matter how much they add or refine to the mechanics, if it isn't fun to go through, well, it defeats the point. So being based off of a movie, and an older one at that, I'm sure it was quite the challenge to make it work in a playable form, on top of not having all the modern tropes to work with. But you know what, they actually did a pretty good job balancing it, all things considered. It still follows all the main beats and locations, there's still the garden maze, the gypsy camp, the train station, and all the main players in the story make a return like Karen Bay and Red Grant. Now, if you were hoping for a one-to-one adaptation from Russia with Love, well, you're kinda shit out of luck. I really enjoy this movie, in fact it's one of my favorites of that era, but there's just no way they could have did a copy and paste. It wouldn't have transitioned well to a gameplay format. But despite that, the team did a really good job on what to change and what new ideas to include. For example, Red Grant, the main villain. In the movie, he's pretty much a mute for the majority of it and he only speaks at a certain point. Whereas now, the moment he's introduced, they give him lines, and it definitely gives a better idea of what he's all about, which is basically to treat Bond as a hunting trophy. This makes him much more interesting in my opinion. I also like that they give him more to do. On top of that, there's new locations to explore, and usually it's where a lot of the fun stuff is added. Like using the watch laser for more than just a select couple puzzles. You can actually use it for offense now. Or the mini helicopter acting as the replacement for the Q-Spider. Or a bunch of segments where you get to fly around in jetpacks. Always a highlight. But what I appreciate the most is the fact that despite all of these new things, maybe outside of the final mission, it still feels like a 1960s Bond film. And to me that's pretty important since that's the game's main shtick. Now, one of the few things to not make a return were the platinum medal objectives, and honestly, good fucking riddance. I like the idea behind them, and for some they could be fun and interesting side challenges, but majority of them are way too hard for its own good. This time it's back to basics where each mission has 4 side objectives to complete, and they're pretty basic stuff like beating it on 00 agent difficulty, beating it under a certain time limit, enemy count, and getting a Bond moment. Sure, it's not as interesting to go for them like the platinum medals were, since really it only unlocks extra bonus levels, but it's not nearly as infuriating or as brutal either, so it's a fair trade-off if you ask me. So as you can tell for single player, it was a pretty good time for me. Is it better than Everything or Nothing? In some ways yes, in other ways no. If anything, I'd say they're pretty equal, and really it'll come down to personal choice. But of course, we're not done yet, still have that multiplayer to discuss. And well, they finally did the normal deathmatch style that felt like such an auto mission last time. But after playing this, oh man, they finally did it. A proper death mode in a third-person style. Before really trying it out again, I was wondering if this style would have been able to hold up, because being able to lock on your enemy sounds like it could have broken the mode, or essentially turning everything into a cover shooter which could lead to a boring experience. Now, it might not be as robust with the amount of characters and options, I mean hell, stages are random for Christ's sakes, but this is still a pretty good attempt. I still don't think it's as good as Nightfire's, but hey, being able to fly around in jetpacks sniping your competition could never get old. The only thing is, I do wish there was some more co-op missions. That was a great time in the last game, so it's a bit of a shame to not see a return here. But I guess the main thing multiplayer in Bond games should have is here, so I guess that's what matters most for this side of the game. But yeah, that was 007 from Russia with Love. A pretty good game, and in my opinion, probably the last really good one. Unfortunately, EA would abandon the license in 2006. Originally, they were going to make a tie-in game for Casino Royale, but canceled it in favor of wanting to focus on original IPs. And honestly, that's a bit of a shame, especially under EA and especially what we know what has become of the company now. But for the mid-2000s, it was a really good time to be a 007 video game fan. Even the crappiest offerings were still passable and playable, and definitely left more of an impact than Activision ever would in my opinion. In fact, I kind of fell out of the Bond games after this title. I did buy a few of Activision's titles, but outside of maybe Bloodstone, probably the best Bond game they made, these titles just felt like Call of Duty clones for the most part. Sure, there were some changes in them, but it just wasn't the same. From Rare's GoldenEye to EA's From Russia with Love, each game left its mark, with majority of them proving that just because it's a licensed game doesn't mean it has to be a cheap cash grab. No, hell no. These were some of the best games of that generation in my opinion, and while the EA Bond era had to stop with this game, at least it went out on a high note. If you enjoy 007 games, be sure to pick this one up, because it's one of the best, and there's no doubts about that.